Most last stands in the Old West ended the same way. The smaller side died. On the morning of June 27, 1874, that should have happened at a lonely trading post in the Texas Panhandle. 28 buffalo hunters, traders, and teamsters were sleeping inside a handful of adobe buildings when hundreds of mounted warriors appeared out of the dawn. The men inside had no cavalry nearby, no telegraph line to summon help, and nowhere to retreat. By every calculation that usually decided survival on the frontier, they should have been wiped out. Instead, they held their ground for days. One rifle shot fired during the siege would become one of the most famous shots in frontier history, a shot so extraordinary that people still debate it nearly a century and a half later. Yet the story of Adobe Walls is larger than a legendary marksman or an improbable survival. It marks one of those moments when an entire way of life on the Great Plains began to slip away. Today, we're stepping inside Adobe Walls during the summer of 1874, following the siege from the first uneasy hours before dawn to the shot that helped end the fight, and exploring why this remote battle became a turning point in the history of the American West. Long before sunrise, the plains around Adobe Walls already carried the smells of the buffalo trade. The settlement sat beside the Canadian River in what is now the Texas Panhandle, surrounded by open grassland that stretched to every horizon. Wind moved constantly across the prairie, carrying dust, the scent of drying hides, and the lingering odor of thousands of buffalo carcasses left behind by commercial hunters. Flies gathered in thick clouds wherever hides were stacked. Wagons stood beside low adobe buildings, their wheels coated in dust from weeks on the trail. Adobe Walls was not much to look at. The entire settlement consisted of a store, a saloon, a blacksmith shop, and a few additional structures built from adobe and cottonwood. From a distance, it hardly resembled a fort at all. There were no stone walls, no blockhouses, and no garrison of soldiers waiting behind defensive works. 28 people occupied the settlement that June morning, including several teenagers who had come west hoping to make money in the buffalo trade. Most expected another ordinary day. The buffalo hunters represented a rapidly expanding business that was transforming the southern plains. Eastern factories demanded buffalo hides for industrial leather, and professional hunters answered that demand with devastating efficiency. Sharps rifles, specially designed for long-range shooting, allowed experienced hunters to kill large numbers of bison from distances that would have seemed remarkable only a generation earlier. For the Comanche, Kiowa, Cheyenne, and other plains peoples, the consequences were impossible to ignore. Buffalo provided food, clothing, shelter, tools, and trade goods. Entire communities depended upon the herds. Every wagon loaded with hides leaving the plains represented more than commercial activity. It represented the disappearance of the animals that had sustained life across the region for centuries. By the summer of 1874, many Native leaders believed that action could no longer be delayed. Among them was Quanah Parker, the son of a Comanche chief and a woman captured as a child during a raid on the Texas frontier. Quanah had grown into one of the most respected war leaders on the southern plains. He and other leaders gathered warriors from several tribes, hoping to strike a powerful blow against the buffalo hunters pushing deeper into their territory. The attack would begin before most of the hunters had finished sleeping. During the night of June 26th, something strange happened inside Adobe Walls. Sometime after midnight, a loud cracking sound echoed through the settlement when the roof of one building suddenly gave way under the weight of stacked sod and recent moisture. The collapse startled everyone awake. Men climbed from their beds, examined the damage, and spent hours repairing the roof by lantern light. The interruption ruined any chance of a full night's rest, but it also meant that many of the hunters remained awake far earlier than usual. A few hours later, that accident may have saved every life inside the settlement. As dawn approached, one of the men looked across the prairie and saw movement. At first, the riders appeared as distant shapes emerging through the early light. Then more figures came into view. Within moments, the scale of the danger became unmistakable. Mounted warriors were approaching from multiple directions, spreading across the plains in numbers that seemed to cover the horizon. The alarm spread instantly. Men ran for rifles, while others rushed toward the nearest buildings. Horses panicked in their corrals as gunfire erupted. Some hunters barely had time to pull on boots before taking positions behind doors, windows, and walls. The warriors struck with tremendous speed. Accounts differ on the exact number involved, but most estimates place the attacking force somewhere between several hundred and 700 fighters. Their strategy relied on overwhelming the settlement before the defenders could organize. For generations, mounted warfare had given Plains warriors enormous advantages in mobility, speed, and shock. Under ordinary circumstances, a settlement as small as Adobe Walls would have been easy prey. Yet the defenders possessed one advantage that would shape the entire battle. Many of the hunters carried heavy Sharps buffalo rifles chambered in powerful calibers such as .50-90 and .45-70. These rifles had been designed for one purpose: killing massive animals at long distances on open ground. The men who used them had spent years reading wind, judging range, and firing across vast stretches of prairie. When the first mounted charges closed on Adobe Walls, those skills suddenly became a matter of survival. Warriors attempting to approach the settlement discovered that they were coming under accurate rifle fire long before reaching effective range themselves. Riders fell from their saddles. Horses stumbled. Charges that might have swept over an ordinary frontier camp began breaking apart under sustained fire. The battle quickly settled into a deadly rhythm. Warriors circled the settlement, searching for weaknesses while rifle reports echoed from the adobe buildings. Smoke drifted through shattered windows. Bullets struck walls and sent fragments of dried adobe flying into the air. Men moved between firing positions, reloading as quickly as possible while trying to conserve ammunition. The defenders understood exactly what failure would mean. No reinforcements were on the way. The nearest military posts lay far away, and even if help had been summoned immediately, reaching Adobe Walls would take time the hunters did not possess. Every attack had to be repelled using only the resources already inside the settlement. As the hours passed, the intensity of the fighting began to change. Repeated assaults failed to overrun the defenders, but the danger remained constant. Warriors maintained pressure around the settlement while snipers targeted anyone who exposed themselves unnecessarily. Inside Adobe Walls, men repaired damaged walls, treated the wounded, and maintained a constant watch over the surrounding plains. The psychological strain steadily increased. The prairie that had once represented opportunity now felt threatening in every direction. Any distant rider might signal another attack. Any movement along the ridges demanded immediate attention. Sleep came in short intervals. Rifles remained close at hand at all times. Days passed this way. Then came the shot everyone remembers. Several days into the siege, a group of warriors appeared on a distant rise overlooking Adobe Walls. The riders remained far beyond what most people considered practical rifle range. Some of the hunters estimated the distance at well over 1,000 yards. Among the defenders stood Billy Dixon, a young buffalo hunter who had spent years hunting across the plains. Dixon later admitted that he did not expect to hit anyone. According to his own account, the men discussed whether such a shot was even possible. Eventually, Dixon rested his heavy Sharps rifle, adjusted his sights, and fired toward the distant group. Witnesses watched the bullet's long flight across the shimmering summer air. Then one of the riders fell. The range was later measured at approximately 1,538 yards, nearly 9/10 of a mile. Historians still debate aspects of the shot. Some emphasize Dixon's extraordinary experience. Others point to luck, favorable conditions, or a combination of both. Whatever factors contributed, nobody disputes the larger effect. The shot changed the atmosphere of the siege. For the defenders, it reinforced confidence in weapons that had already preserved their lives for days. For the warriors watching from the surrounding hills, the message was equally clear. Remaining beyond traditional engagement distances no longer guaranteed safety. Soon afterward, the large-scale attacks ceased. Adobe Walls had survived. From a purely tactical perspective, the outcome seemed remarkable. Fewer than 30 men had withstood overwhelming numbers and avoided destruction. Stories of the defense spread quickly across the frontier, and Billy Dixon's shot entered Western legend. Yet the wider consequences extended far beyond the settlement itself. The attack on Adobe Walls helped trigger the Red River War, a major military campaign aimed at forcing the Comanche, Kiowa, Southern Cheyenne, and Arapaho onto reservations. Over the following months, soldiers, scouts, and civilian auxiliaries pushed relentlessly across the southern plains. At the same time, buffalo herds continued to collapse. As the animals disappeared, the foundation supporting the traditional plains way of life weakened with them. Leaders such as Quanah Parker eventually faced choices that earlier generations had never imagined. Resistance gradually gave way to negotiation, adaptation, and life on reservations. Even Adobe Walls itself did not endure for long. The settlement was abandoned only a few years after the battle, leaving behind little more than ruins on the prairie where so many people had fought to shape the future of the region. That contradiction gives Adobe Walls its lasting power. The hunters survived through courage, experience, and technology. Their rifles allowed them to overcome impossible odds. At the same time, those same rifles formed part of a larger transformation, already reshaping the Great Plains. The siege lasted only a few days. The world it helped bring about would last forever.